There are new Big 12 teams out west that are leery of adding ACC schools when there are options on the coast out there. What do you say we bring in a Wazoo or Oregon State? This is a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Cougars crossover.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Thursday, everybody. Welcome to a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Cougars crossover. I'm Drake Toll from the number one Big 12 podcast in the country, Locked On Big 12. That is Jake Hatch of Locked On Cougars, bringing you all things BYU every single day as a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Today, we're going to go through how BYU is ready to expand out west, though. All this ACC talk is getting a little too far from teams like Arizona, BYU, Arizona State, and the like. Also, middle segment, BYU schedule, not as bad as I thought it was a month ago, and we'll end with who will be the offensive star for the Cougars. Off the riff here, it matters for the entire conference expansion. It's a big topic right now. Jake, as you hear names like NC State or Pitt or Louisville as additions to the conference, it seems like for Utah, BYU, and Arizona, when Washington State, who has really good TV viewership numbers, or Oregon State, who has football brand prowess now, are on the table, why not bring somebody in a little more regional for you?
Well, and that's the thing. I was on your podcast, I don't know how long ago, and I was arguing for that. And that's the thing. I'm a West Coast born and bred guy. And if you can get schools that are closer to me, speaking namely Oregon State, Washington State, I'm all about that. But let me also acknowledge the fact that out here on the West Coast, there's not a lot of other attractive options, frankly. I'll just be very honest about that. Yeah. So if you can get a Louisville, or if you can go for one of the big dogs of the ACC, say,
well, Jake, I hate to interrupt you here, but there are a lot of people I think that from there will go, wait a second, what about Fresno State? What about San Diego State? What about Boise State? Those don't push the needle for you.
Here's the thing. They all have brand power in certain segments. Let's say San Diego State, they got basketball. Gonzaga has basketball too, but here's Boise State's got football. The problem is none of them bring the overall brand prowess that I think would elevate the Big 12. That's why I kind of softened my stance where if you can get a Louisville was one of the programs that when the Big 12 originally was going to expand way back in the mid-20s, they probably should have grabbed Louisville at that time before the ACC scooped them up. I'm speaking kind of in revisionist history, but I just don't see out here on the West Coast a true power brand outside of Wazoo or Oregon State. And even then, they maybe don't stir the drink, as you kind of mentioned earlier on, that really elevates this conference.
The fact that Washington State loses its athletic director to Washington and gets buried in like this quasi Mountain West scheduling thing. Now at this point, if I'm a fan of them or Oregon State, it feels like this timer has been set. And the longer you are irrelevant, the longer you're in the middle pack of, and BYU felt this for a long time, the wilderness, the longer you're there, the more you get pushed down and buried in college football and the less people focus on you. How imperative is it that those two schools, even for the sake of BYU, who wants more regional rivalries, try to fight their way into the conference?
They've got to find something. There's no doubt about that because, trust me, BYU spent 13 years as an independent trying to get to where they're at today. And I'm sure that Tom Homo and the BYU administration feels some sympathy for Wazoo and for Oregon State, just looking at it and saying, hey, good luck, guys, because it's a really, really tough road to travel when you're doing what they're doing. And they even have, like I said, they have that scheduling agreement with the Mountain West. But you're pushing yourself into football irrelevancy, and that's not a good place to be. Now, Drake, I've listened to your podcast. I watch it often. You've talked a lot about the ACC blowing up. If it truly is going to blow up, why doesn't the Big 12 go get the Bay Area schools? Because nothing against Stanford and Cal. I know that they maybe politically aren't necessarily all too keen on joining the Big 12, but if you want some power brands, those might be the two most likely on the West Coast to go grab if the ACC is going to implode.
I love that you went there, Jake, because now you're adding teams that are much closer to BYU than a Wake Forest or a Miami here. That Cal and Stanford, did those push the envelope for you? I mean, if given the option of NC State and Virginia Tech or Cal and Stanford, where do you lie?
Okay, if it's football, give me those East Coast schools. Yeah. If it's everything else,
I'll
go with the other two. That's the differentiator of all of this right now. Is what is Brett Yormark and the Big 12 looking at? Do they want overall prowess? Sure, that means Cal and Stanford. You add them if that's the case. But if you're looking for more eyeballs football wise, Louisville, Virginia Tech, NC State, even one of the big dogs. Let's say in Miami, you can pick them off. You absolutely go grab those schools. So I think it's all about philosophically what the Big 12 is looking for.
Do you groan if BYU is playing Virginia Tech in a conference game, or if BYU's schedule now adds 4 teams from the East Coast that are all good? I mean, look, Cougars fans travel better than anybody else in the conference already. But instead of traveling to, say, the Bay Area, you're traveling to the middle of the Outer Banks. Yeah. Is that something the BYU fans want to do, or is that not again?
Well, I think BYU fans got very used during their independent run of traveling literally all over the country. I remember I have a cousin who lives in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He's a professor at Middle Tennessee State University, and he reached out to me. BYU played a game there. I don't remember what year it was, and half of the stands at MTSU were BYU fans. They go literally everywhere. They've gone to Georgia State. They've gone to these different places. Not Georgia State. They went, but nonetheless, they've got Georgia Southern. That's who it was.
That's it.
They've gone all over the country. So, yeah, I think that there'll be BYU fans that would like to have some more regional trips. Yeah, being able to make the trip to the Bay Area, that's a really short flight and an easy trip to make if you're a Cougar fan living in Utah and the Intermountain West. But at the same time, BYU fans are well aware of the brand prowess that a Virginia Tech and NC State, Wake Forest can bring. And traveling to those places, I think would be actually a thing that BYU fans would embrace, because it's not something you're making the trip every single year. There's enough schools in this conference right now that it's going to be every 3 or 4 years that you have that opportunity. So I think it keeps it fresh enough that you would be intrigued about maybe going to Raleigh, North Carolina every so often.
I don't hate BYU's schedule as much as I did a couple of months ago, and maybe I need to convince myself that the Cougars have a chance to go to a bowl game this year, but I have you here to do that, Jake, here on Locked On Big 12, Locked On Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you all by eBay Motors. Keep your ride or die alive. I have a car sitting outside right now. It's a Nissan Maxima 2016 model. And every time I drive, it's got this little sound underneath it. There's a big plastic piece that as I drive makes noise. So I cut it off with a pair of scissors or pliers or whatever that I used to cut it off. And I'm going to shoot you straight. Not the best thing to do. I went to eBay Motors and said, eBay Motors, how do I not do this anymore? Can I get the part from you? And they said, yes, with passion, drive, and patience, you can keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. They have millions of parts. And with eBay's guaranteed fit, they are guaranteed to fit. With 122 million parts, eBay has what you need. Keep your ride or die alive. ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit. Only available to U.S. customers. That is ebaymotors.com. Jake Hatch, Locked On Cougars. Drake Toll, Locked On Big 12. BYU schedule is one that when I initially looked at it, thought, oh, that's not good. Arizona and Kansas State. And I don't think Baylor's good, but going on the road is not great. And Oklahoma State's good. You got to go to Orlando. There are games here that certainly, look, let's be clear. BYU at 8-4 is going to be a great season. There are games that BYU is going to lose. They're not going to go undefeated. However, as the more I look at a Southern Illinois, which is a win, an SMU, who I watched lose to Boston College in a bowl game. A Wyoming, a very tough game on the road, but still BYU's the better football team. And then, sure, you get Kansas State, which is tough, but I think Baylor, not just a winnable game. I have BYU winning that game. You've got Arizona State, Houston at the end of the schedule. I see 6 that I just don't know how BYU loses. I'm sure they could, but I see 6 where I still believe BYU's the better football team. Am I buying in? The Cougar tail is a little bit too hard.
Well, hey, I'll get you Cougar till the next time you're out here. I promise you that. But I think you're right, because you look at the schedule and when you're doing BYU's kind of the math, the path to bowl eligibility, you're looking for wins. Yeah, the 3 non-conference games. If BYU wants to go bowling, you've got to sweep those games. You've got to be Southern Illinois. You got to go to SMU and win there, and you got to beat Wyoming. Now, they're very tough games, I think, both at SMU and Wyoming, but you got to win those. And then you're right. The final 2 games of the year, Arizona State and Houston. Yeah, they should be improved by the end of the year, but they're in the same vicinity in my mind of where BYU is going to be picked in the preseason poll. So you win those 2 games, that's 5 wins. And then Baylor, Baylor's a bit of an enigma out there. What are they ultimately going to look like? And you have to go down to Waco to play that game, but that's 6 wins if you can pick those off alone. So along the way, if you at home, BYU's been a very, very solid program. Kansas State coming in for the very first Big 12 home game of the season. I know Kansas State's a very, very good team, but I can tell you, Cougar fans, they're going to be absolutely juiced for that game in terms of being at Lavelle Edwards Stadium and going to UCF. The thing is, I think BYU, the whole goal this season is to get to the bowl season. So getting to 6-6, that's the whole goal for the Cougars in football wise. And you're right, looking at the schedule, there appears to be games that BYU should be the favorite in. And I think there's, probably 5 or 6 that they should be favored in.
By the time BYU gets to Waco against Baylor, and sitting at 3-1, people are beginning to talk. That is the goal. BYU being 3-1 at that point. Kansas State is tough. I assume out of those first 4 games, you're going to drop 1. Then you go to Waco, where at that point, Baylor will be porous enough that you got a chance to pack out the stadium and have more BYU fans than Baylor fans and turn it into Provo East. The Arizona game being at home. And I think, Jake, one thing I do go back to what you alluded to with Lavelle Edwards Stadium. Last year, there was BYU, and then there was BYU home night game. And it feels like most years that is probably the case because of the magic that Provo presents. Is that going to give you a leg up enough, though, to beat an Arizona or an Oklahoma State?
Well, there's that you talk about it. They call it the Vampire Cougs is what they were calling it last year. That when they were playing at night, they were seemingly invincible. When they played during the day, it was like, who is this team? Now, the other thing is BYU on the road last year struggled mightily. They obviously I think that West Virginia game sticks in a lot of people's minds out here in Provo. Just the way that BYU kind of rolled over and played dead in that game, seemingly. The bigger thing I think BYU understands is a program. Talking with people around the program, they were embarrassed. They started the season 5-2 last year. There was a lot of talk about could they get to 6, 7, 8 wins, and where could this ultimately end up? And then they suffered a 5-game losing streak, and that has stuck in the craw of everybody in that program, and they want to get back on top. So, yes, I think they're understanding that they have to play better, whether it's day game, away, no matter when that game is scheduled, they've got to bring it every single time. And I think this program learned a lot last year, especially that humbling 5-game losing streak to end the season.
Let's go, Jake. Southern Illinois, SMU, Wyoming. I assume BYU will either be favored in each of those or right around it. In my book, they're the better team in those 3 non-conference games. I know a lot of people are high on SMU, but again, I'm never able to really buy the hype of that now ACC team. Past that, I think Baylor, Arizona State, Houston. Those are the 6 where I see BYU as the better team, regardless of home or away. They just are the football team that on the gridiron I would take. Where from there, if let's say those 6 games go your way, where from there can BYU sneak out wins? Which games do you point out and say, you know what, circle this one because the Cougars have a fighter's chance, even if everyone else counts them out?
I'm actually looking at that Arizona game. The thing about this is Arizona went through a coaching change, and trust me, Brett Brennan is a very, very capable coach. He did really good at San Jose State, but they are still going through a coaching transition, and who knows what that's going to look like year 1 on the job there in Tucson. Jed Fish did an incredible job, but he left them high and dry, and I think there's a jilted lover type feel down there in Tucson, and there's some talent that left that program to travel with him to Seattle and Washington, but there's other guys who went elsewhere. So I think Arizona, yes, they have Tateroa McMillan. I know they have the quarterback Fafita as well, but I just feel like they may be a little more depleted than some people think they are coming into this year. So that is one that I've got circled as a potential win for BYU just because of how everything went down with the Wildcats.
We've given the ceiling. This has been a very positive segment here about BYU. Jake, let's touch on where things could go wrong. And even if you ask an outside source, somebody out there may say, oh, well, they'll lose to SMU and Wyoming. And, well, they'll by then, Houston might be improved. I mean, there are people who are going to poke holes in all of this. What is that worst case scenario? What is the floor for the Cougars?
The worst case scenario is, you go 1-2 in the non-conference, and then you're feeling kind of down on yourselves. You've lost at Wyoming, and BYU fans, I can tell you, they are upset that BYU is even making that trip to Laramie. Tom Homo, their athletic director, said, hey, we want to be a good friend to these programs who helped us out during the independent era. Now, going to Laramie, that would be there's a whole famous quote from Lavelle Edwards Drake about, I'd rather lose and live in Provo than win and live in Laramie. It's lived on for 4 decades now since he made that quote. quote, after a loss up at Wyoming during the WAC era for BYU. So yeah, they go 1-2 out of the gate. Then at that point, I think Cougar fans, there's a lot of heat on Kalani Sitake, his coaching staff as a whole. And at that point, they're probably feeling down about themselves. Kansas State comes in, kicks them around. And then after that, what are you looking at as a favored win? Even going to Baylor, I know that like we talked about Baylor as being a win here, still going on the road. That's a tough deal. And BYU lost last time they played down there at Baylor. So the problem is if you get off to a slow start, you're 1-2 in the non-conference, is the next time you're favored in a game Arizona State on the second to last weekend of the season and the following week against Houston? That very much could be the case. And that would be a consideration of 3-9, 2-10. And at that point, heads, I think, absolutely would roll for BYU.
Yeah, it wouldn't be good. 3-9 wouldn't be good. Coming up, what could be good are a few of these offensive stars for the Cougars. This is Locked On Cougars, Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Talent Solutions. LinkedIn Talent Solutions is where I go whenever I need to find an intern to run social media because I'm not very good at the social media thing on Twitter all the time. I say things that are a little bit too far out there. I hired my friend Zach at LinkedIn.com/Locked On College. Zach has done a great job of asking questions, building engagement, and he is from LinkedIn Talent Solutions. 86% of small businesses can get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at LinkedIn.com/Locked On College. That is LinkedIn.com/Locked On College to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. It is LinkedIn.com where you can find the next big hire for your small business or independent business. LinkedIn.com. Jake Hatch of Locked On Cougars covering all things BYU. Drake Toll from Locked On Big 12. Who's the guy? When you look at the BYU offense and say, all right, something's got to change based on the last couple of games last season. Is it Gary Bohannon, Jake Retzlaff? I mean, who's the guy where you go, all right, on our cover of EA Sports 25, this is the Cougar?
I'm actually going to go running back. LJ Martin. That's the guy I would say needs to be the face of BYU this year. Last year, I thought the quarterback situation for BYU was the least of their worries in many respects. The offensive line was really, really rough for a long stretch of that season. The running back injuries and the kind of the rotating cast of characters that were in the backfield really hurt BYU as well. LJ Martin is a guy that's a thoroughbred running back, a 4-star prospect out of El Paso, Texas. A lot of Cougar fans were excited to see what he's capable of last year, and he got pressed into action a lot earlier on in his time at BYU than many expected. I got out to spring ball this year, Drake, and they listed him at 6'1", 225 pounds. He was listed at 6'1", 205 last year as a freshman coming in. I'm like, all right, let's see if that's legitimate. Then he comes walking out to spring ball, and I looked over, I'm like, okay, he's legitimately 225 pounds.
Yeah.
He is packed on the muscle. He looks the part. And BYU needs a running back of the ilk of Jamal Williams, Tyler Algier, the guys that have been really, really good running backs for BYU in the recent past. They need a guy like that to take the stress off of whoever the quarterback's going to be. So, yeah, the guy I'm going to pin my hopes on is LJ Martin really emerging and becoming a star for BYU football.
The quarterback position, I'm glad you mentioned that, Jake, and there are offensive linemen who are returning, 4 guys with starting experience who are returning this year for BYU. That, to me, in the same way Oklahoma State has 10 defensive starters returning, you go, yeah, but they were 86th in the country in scoring defense. So it's sure they're back, but I don't know if we can automatically say they're going to be good. And I do believe that the same is true for BYU's offensive line, and Martin will have to pick that up. And that line is protecting who at quarterback? I mean, do we have any clear front runner between Retzlaff and Bohannon?
I think right now the nod still goes to Jake Retzlaff. Now I think that's like a razor thin margin, quite honestly. And they also added another player in McKay Hillstead that I think is absolutely going to factor in training camp. So that's the interesting part of how training camp's going to play out over the month. It starts July 30th ahead of their August 31st opener. That month leading up to that, it's going to be interesting, especially the first 2 weeks of training camp, to see who really emerges. Now, right now, so we're looking at this, we're in mid to late June. I would say right now, game 1, it's still going to be Jake Retzlaff under center to start the season. Now, if you ask me at the end of the season, is Jake Retzlaff still the starter? I can't guarantee that because I do think that if he falters at all, they will turn to Bohannon or Hillstead and will not give a second thought to it.
Help. Jake, this is every off season, every host I talk to, there's the host at Oklahoma State, locked on Oklahoma State, who's going, oh, I can't believe we have Alan Bowman. We don't have to rotate through 3 quarterbacks. He's the guy. It's so much better to have the guy. And then you go to the Locked On Baylor host, and he goes, well, you got 2 quarterbacks you're kind of vying for it, from DeQuan Finn down to Sawyer Robertson, and it's a good thing to have 2. You want competition, so you get the best of both worlds. It varies by host and whether or not you want the competition or you want the guy to be in the locker room. Mm-hmm. Jake, by week 3, does BYU need to have the guy? Did this competition need to be over? When do we have to figure out who the rest of the season is under at quarterback?
Week 3 at the latest, honestly. Yeah. Here's the thing. BYU's got 50 years of quarterbacking tradition. This is a program for many years under LaVell Edwards is known as QBU. They have guys who have finished in the top 3 of Heisman Trophy awards. Yep. They've got NFL MVP, Super Bowl champions that were quarterbacks at BYU. Cougar fans know good quarterbacking when they see it, and they've been benefited. The last 2 quarterbacks that started for them before last season were Zach Wilson and Jaron Hall. So they know
who have started NFL games somehow.
Yeah, exactly. So they know good quarterbacks when they see them. The question is, who of this trio is going to emerge? And they've got to have that person emerge. Week 3, that's the very latest. I think in their heart of hearts, BYU staff would like to have a guy come out in the first 2 weeks of training camp, essentially say he's the guy. He's emerged. He has separated himself from the pack, and they're able to ride that guy for the entire season. But having a capable backup, it's absolutely a necessity, but you don't want to have the whole thing. Having 2 quarterbacks means you have none. That's absolutely true in this case. So the Cougars have got to find somebody, and week 3 is probably the very latest until they settle on that.
From the standpoint of wide receiver for BYU, I don't know if I've heard enough.
Okay.
How do you feel about the position? Because I, in preparation for our interview today, I was like, you know what? I'm going to go not just to the KSLs of the world, but also to the BYU website and let's see what the media guide looks like. And I thought the one prevalent thing that we're missing almost everywhere, to me at least, is receiver. Where are the guys that you think will step up and play a big role in that position?
Well, the nice part is they're bringing back their top 7 pass catchers. Now, one of them, Keanu Hill, has moved to tight end, and I think he's going to be an absolute weapon at that position. He's bulked up.
Then why are we talking about the top 7? Yeah, why are we all leading our articles with this? Anybody who's listening right now from the just lead with that.
They should, absolutely, because I have been talking to some people around the program. The name Darius Lassiter continues to emerge as a guy that was really, really good during spring ball. Now, he was a guy that was quite good at points last year. He had some very phenomenal moments, but there was there'd be a highlight and then he'd kind of disappear for a little bit. They need him to emerge as that quote unquote alpha at wide receiver. But even if it's not him, if it's a Chase Roberts or Cody Epps, or if Keanu Hill at tight end becomes the star that something people think he can be in his final season in a Cougar uniform, they have a lot of guys that are very good with the ball in their hands. The question, I think, in most people's minds is who's getting the ball into their hands at quarterback.
Yeah, I love it. I had to pull it up here. The BYU release says 5 experienced receivers. That's it. That's all they give, the nod to the pass catchers. And maybe that goes to show how by committee it was last year, that you didn't have one all-star stand. And Keanu Hill now being at the tight end spot is going to be an adjustment that it hopefully opens up the BYU offense even more. Jake, before we get you out of here, for the Cougars, for the offense, is that the side of the ball where you're going to lean on this? Because I know the defense with Ben Bywater back and healthy at linebacker is what I look at. Is the offense just going to need to be a decent byproduct of what the defense gives you?
The offense is still going to, I think, have to carry the defense in certain circumstances, because I just think there's question marks along the defensive front in particular. The defensive line, they need to have some guys step up and just establish that they can hold up against power running attacks. You mentioned Oklahoma State, the Ollie Gordons of the world, even some of the lesser running backs in this
team. White, if you're, but there's all across the conference, So
they've got to be able to prove they can hold up against rushing attacks of other teams. But BYU's offense outside the quarterback position, I think, is upgraded across the board. So if you can get even just steady quarterback play, I think that's enough to lift this program to a 6-win mark. Now, that's me saying that in June, and obviously we'll see how it plays out during the season, but there are going to be certain circumstances where the offense is still going to have to carry that defense. I think Jay Hill is doing a lot of good work in overhauling this defense and getting it to play at a higher level. I still feel like it might be a season away before he really gets things where he wants it to be.
Yeah. Jake, if folks who listen to Locked On Big 12 want to find more of you, where can they get it?
Search out Locked On Cougars wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on social media, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter under that handle. You can see it if you're watching this on YouTube. My personal handle, Jacob C. Hatch. Reach out anytime. We love talking BYU. We also mix in a lot of Big 12 topics along the way as well. And I am a big fan of your podcast as well. So I'm an everydayer of Locked On Big 12 as well.
That's awesome. And my podcast is Locked On Big 12. Thanks for making these two shows your first listen every single day. Find even more of these wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, as Jake said. This has been, and it always will be, Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Cougars and Doce Grande.